December 1st, 1989, 9:30 a.m. Volusia County Sheriff's deputies responded to a report of a vehicle abandoned on a dirt road off Interstate 95 near Ormond Beach, Florida. The 1988 Pontiac Sunbird sat empty, driver's door open, keys in the ignition, engine cold. Deputy Doug Sexton approached the vehicle cautiously, noting bloodstains on the driver's seat and dashboard. He followed a trail of disturbed pine needles into the scrub palmetto about 50 feet from the road. That's where he found the body. Peter Seams, 65, lay on his back in the undergrowth, covered with a piece of carpet. He'd been shot twice in the torso at close range with a .22 caliber weapon. His wallet was missing. His car was missing. The Sunbird had been stolen from the scene after his murder. Sexton radioed for homicide detectives, but he didn't yet know that Peter Seams was the 7th victim in a series of highway murders that had terrorized Central Florida for 13 months. He didn't know that 2 women were responsible, hitchhiking along the I-75, I-4, and I-95, getting picked up by middle-aged men, then robbing and executing them on remote access roads. And he didn't know that the killers were about to make a mistake that would end the deadliest female serial killing spree in American history. The investigation had begun 11 months earlier, in December 1988, when the body of Richard Mallory, 51, was found in a wooded area off Highway 40 in Volusia County. Mallory had been shot 3 times with a .22 caliber pistol, once in the left arm, once in the chest, once in the neck. His car, a 1977 Cadillac, was found abandoned days later in Ormond Beach, wiped clean of fingerprints. Investigators initially treated it as a robbery homicide, possibly drug-related. Mallory owned a small electronics repair shop, had been known to frequent prostitutes, and had a past conviction for rape. The case went cold quickly. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no clear motive beyond robbery. Then the pattern emerged. On June 1st, 1990, David Spears, 43, a heavy equipment operator, was found shot 6 times with a .22 caliber weapon, his naked body dumped in a wooded area off Highway 19 in Citrus County. His truck was found abandoned 50 miles away. On June 6th, Charles Carskaddon, 40, was found shot 9 times with a .22, his body left in Pasco County, his car abandoned in Marion County. On July 4th, Troy Burris, 50, a sausage salesman, was found in Marion County, shot twice with a .22. His delivery truck was found days later in Ocala. On August 4th, Charles Humphreys, 56, a retired Air Force major and former police chief, was found shot 7 times in Marion County. His car recovered in Sewanee County. On September 12th, Walter Antonio, 60, a truck driver and police reserve officer, was found shot 4 times in Dixie County. His car found in Brevard County. 7 men, all middle-aged, all shot with a .22 caliber weapon, all killed along Florida's central highway system, all found in wooded areas off remote roads. Their vehicles were always stolen and abandoned miles from the murder sites. Their wallets and cash were always missing. The murders occurred roughly every 6 weeks, suggesting a cooling-off period between kills. By September 1990, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement knew they were hunting a serial killer, but the profile didn't fit any established pattern. The victims weren't sexually assaulted. The murders weren't ritualistic. The motive appeared to be robbery, but the level of violence suggested something deeper. Rage, perhaps, or a profound hatred of the victim type. Then came the break. On July 4th, 1990, the same day Troy Burris was murdered, 2 women were involved in a car accident in Orange Springs, Florida. Witnesses saw them abandon Peter Seams' Pontiac Sunbird after crashing it and flee into the woods. The women were described as white, in their 30s, one heavyset with blonde hair, the other slender with dark hair. Investigators connected the Sunbird to the December 1989 discovery. Peter Seams had been reported missing by his family that same week, and his body was eventually identified through the vehicle. But by the time authorities realized the women from the crash were connected to the murders, they were long gone. The witnesses provided detailed descriptions. Police worked with a forensic artist to create composite sketches. The drawings showed two women, rough-looking, possibly prostitutes or drifters. The sketches were released to the media in November 1990. Tips flooded in. Multiple callers identified the women as Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore, known to frequent biker bars in the Daytona Beach area. Undercover officers began surveillance at bars where the women were known to drink. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested outside the Last Resort biker bar in Volusia County on an outstanding warrant for firearms possession. Tyria Moore was located at her sister's house in Pennsylvania and brought in for questioning. What emerged over the next weeks of interrogation was a story of desperation, delusion, and murder. Aileen Wuornos, 34, had been working as a highway prostitute for years, hitchhiking along Florida's interstate system, exchanging sex for money with men who picked her up. Tyria Moore, 28, was her girlfriend and companion, living off the money Aileen brought home from prostitution. Between December 1989 and November 1990, Aileen had killed 7 men who'd picked her up, claiming self-defense in some cases, admitting to cold-blooded robbery murder in others. She'd shot them with a .22 pistol she kept in her bag, stolen their vehicles and possessions, and returned to Tyria with cash and belongings from the victims. Tyria claimed she hadn't known about the murders, though she'd benefited from the stolen property and never asked too many questions about where the money came from. But to understand how Aileen Wuornos became America's first female serial killer, you have to go back to the beginning, to a childhood so traumatic that it's difficult to comprehend how she survived it at all. Aileen Carol Pittman was born February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a psychopathic child molester who was in prison at the time of her birth, serving time for kidnapping and sodomizing a 7-year-old boy. He would later hang himself in prison. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was 15 years old when Aileen was born, 16 when she gave birth to Aileen's brother Keith. Diane abandoned both children when Aileen was 4, leaving them with her parents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. The children were told that Lori and Britta were their parents, that their mother was actually their older sister. Aileen didn't learn the truth until she was 11. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic who beat the children regularly. Britta was cold and distant, offering no protection or affection. By age 9, Aileen and her brother Keith were engaging in sexual activity with each other, a response to the abuse and neglect that had become their normal. By 11, Aileen was trading sexual favors with neighborhood boys for cigarettes and spare change. At 14, she was pregnant, raped by one of her grandfather's friends, though she later claimed she didn't know who the father was. She gave birth to a son at a home for unwed mothers and gave him up for adoption. She never saw him again. At 15, her grandmother died. Her grandfather threw her out of the house. She dropped out of school and began living in the woods near her home, surviving by prostitution. She hitchhiked, offering sex to drivers for money. She was raped multiple times, beaten by clients, arrested repeatedly for prostitution, drunk and disorderly conduct, and assault. By her late teens, she'd been raped and brutalized so many times that violence and sex had become indistinguishable in her mind. Men were predators or customers, never protectors, never safe. In 1976, Aileen hitchhiked to Florida, seeking a warmer climate for survival on the streets. She worked as a prostitute in Daytona Beach, living in cheap motels or sleeping rough. She was arrested dozens of times. Prostitution, forgery, armed robbery. In 1981, she robbed a convenience store while wearing a man's clothing and was sentenced to prison. She served time, was released, returned to prostitution. The cycle continued. Violent men, degrading sex, minimal money, arrests, brief jail stays, release. Repeat. She developed a violent temper, fighting with clients who tried to cheat her, assaulting people who disrespected her. She drank heavily, consumed drugs when available, and nursed a burning rage against the world that had used and discarded her repeatedly. She later claimed she'd been raped or beaten by numerous men who picked her up. Some of these claims were documented in police reports. Others were impossible to verify. But the pattern was clear. Aileen Wuornos had learned through brutal experience that men who picked up hitchhiking prostitutes felt entitled to hurt them, and that society didn't care when they did. In 1986, Aileen met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. Tyria was younger, softer, less damaged. Aileen fell in love immediately and desperately. Tyria represented something Aileen had never had: genuine affection, companionship, someone who saw her as more than a body to be used. They moved in together. Aileen supported them both through prostitution, hitchhiking along I-95 and other highways, getting into cars with middle-aged men, having sex with them on back roads, taking their money. Tyria didn't work regularly, content to let Aileen provide. Aileen was desperate to keep Tyria happy, to keep her from leaving, to prove her worth through the only means she knew: money earned through her body. By 1989, Aileen was exhausted, bitter, and full of rage. She was 33 years old. She'd been raped, beaten, and used by men for 2 decades. She carried a .22 pistol for protection. Legally, she told herself, though she was a convicted felon prohibited from owning firearms. On November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallory picked her up as she hitchhiked near Daytona Beach. What happened next depends on whose story you believe. Aileen claimed Mallory drove her to a remote area, produced a bottle of vodka laced with something that made her dizzy, then tied her to the steering wheel and raped her violently. She said she managed to get her gun from her bag, shot him in self-defense, then panicked and took his money and car. Investigators found no physical evidence of rape. Mallory's car showed no signs of struggle. His body had been shot 3 times in execution-style pattern. But what investigators didn't know during the trial, what wouldn't be discovered until years later, was that Richard Mallory had served 10 years in prison for rape and had been accused of violent sexual assaults by multiple women. It's possible Aileen was telling the truth about the first killing. It's possible it was self-defense. But the other 6 killings weren't self-defense. Aileen admitted as much. David Spears shot 6 times. Charles Carskadden shot 9 times. Troy Burris shot twice. Charles Humphreys shot 7 times. Walter Antonio shot 4 times. Peter Seams shot twice. She claimed some of them threatened her, that she shot them before they could hurt her. But the evidence showed otherwise. The victims were shot at close range while sitting in their vehicles or walking away from them. Their bodies showed no signs of struggle. Their positions suggested they'd been taken by surprise, shot without warning, executed. Aileen's motive was robbery. She needed money to support herself and Tyria. She was tired of prostitution, but had no other skills, no education, no legitimate way to survive. The first killing showed her that robbing and killing clients was more profitable than having sex with them. She could take their cash, their credit cards, their cars. She could sell their belongings. She could make in one night what would take weeks of degrading prostitution to earn. And she convinced herself they deserved it. These men who picked up hitchhiking prostitutes, who paid for sex, who she assumed were all potential rapists and abusers. She was wrong. David Spears was a construction worker heading home to his family. Troy Burris was a delivery driver with a wife and children. Charles Humphreys was a retired police chief and grandfather. These men weren't perfect. They'd picked up a prostitute after all. But they didn't deserve execution. Aileen projected her rage at every man who'd ever hurt her onto these strangers, seeing them not as individuals, but as representatives of a gender that had brutalized her. In her mind, she was fighting back against 20 years of victimization. In reality, she was murdering people for money and convenience. After each killing, she returned to Tyria with cash, belongings, and sometimes the victim's car. She told Tyria vague stories about where the items came from. Tyria accepted the explanations without pressing too hard. When Aileen came home with a camera, Tyria used it to take photographs. When Aileen came home with tools, Tyria helped sell them at pawn shops. When Aileen came home with a car, Tyria rode in it. She claimed later she didn't know the items were from murder victims, but her incuriosity was convenient. As long as she didn't ask direct questions, she could maintain plausible deniability. After Aileen's arrest, detectives used Tyria to get a confession. They told Tyria she could be charged as an accessory unless she cooperated. They had her call Aileen in jail. Multiple recorded phone calls where Tyria pleaded with Aileen to confess, saying she was scared, that police were questioning her, that Aileen needed to tell the truth so Tyria wouldn't be implicated. Aileen, desperate to protect the woman she loved, confessed to all 7 murders. She insisted Tyria had known nothing. She took full responsibility. She described the killings in detail, trying to explain her thinking, her fear, her rage. Her confessions were contradictory. She claimed self-defense in the Mallory killing and suggested the others had also threatened her. But the physical evidence didn't support claims of self-defense. The victims had been shot without warning, often multiple times, always in ways that suggested execution rather than defense. Prosecutors argued that Aileen had become a predator, using her vulnerability as bait, allowing men to pick her up, then robbing and killing them when opportunity arose. The defense argued she was a battered woman with PTSD from decades of sexual violence who genuinely believed these men would hurt her. The truth was probably somewhere in between. The first killing might have been self-defense, but once Aileen realized she could get away with it, could profit from it, could channel her rage into violence without consequences, she kept killing. Each murder made the next one easier. The psychological barrier that prevents most people from taking a life had been eroded by years of trauma and violence. By the time she killed Walter Antonio, a reserve police officer whose weapon she stole, she was executing men coldly and efficiently, taking their possessions and moving on to the next victim. Aileen Wuornos went to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory in January 1992. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Her confessions, ballistics matching all 7 victims to the same point, .22 pistol, fingerprints in several victims' vehicles, items from victims found in her possession, and testimony from Tyria Moore describing Aileen's strange behavior and sudden possession of men's belongings. The defense argued temporary insanity, borderline personality disorder, and a lifetime of sexual trauma that made her unable to distinguish between genuine threat and perceived threat. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Uriel Blount sentenced her to death by electrocution. She was subsequently convicted in 3 additional murder cases, receiving death sentences in each. She pleaded no contest to the remaining 3 murders. By the end of 1992, Aileen Wuornos had been sentenced to death 6 times. Florida law required separate trials for each victim. She spent 12 years on death row at Broward Correctional Institution. During that time, she gave numerous interviews, her story changing with each telling. Sometimes she claimed all the killings were self-defense. Sometimes she admitted they were robbery murders. Sometimes she claimed she was a political prisoner being executed for defending herself against rape. She became increasingly paranoid and delusional, convinced that prison guards were beaming sonic pressure waves into her cell to control her mind. Mental health experts debated whether she'd become psychotic or had always been mentally ill and was finally deteriorating completely. She fired her attorneys, demanded her execution be carried out immediately, and claimed she wanted to die to escape the torture she was experiencing in prison. Some anti-death penalty advocates argued she was too mentally ill to be executed. Others argued she was manipulating the system, playing insane to generate appeals. The courts determined she was competent to waive her appeals and request execution. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." She was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. She was 46 years old. Her body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered beneath a Michigan tree by her childhood friend, Dawn Botkins. The families of her victims attended the execution or released statements describing their relief that justice had finally been served. Richard Mallory's family spoke of the years stolen from them. David Spear's children described growing up without a father. Charles Humphreys' widow talked about the devoted husband and grandfather who'd been taken from them. These men weren't perfect, but they were fathers, husbands, sons. They'd made the mistake of stopping for a hitchhiker, of seeking out a prostitute, of showing vulnerability to a woman who had learned to see vulnerability as opportunity. The case of Aileen Wuornos raises uncomfortable questions about victimhood and violence. She was genuinely victimized, raped, beaten, abused throughout her life. The system failed her repeatedly. She was abandoned as a child, preyed upon as a teenager, criminalized and brutalized as an adult. No one helped her. No one intervened. She fell through every social safety net and survived by selling her body to men who often treated her with contempt or violence. All of that is true. But none of it justifies murdering 7 people. Being victimized doesn't give someone the right to become a victimizer. Suffering doesn't excuse causing suffering. Aileen Wuornos made choices. She chose to keep killing after the first murder. She chose to target men who picked her up, projecting her rage onto strangers who hadn't personally hurt her. She chose money and revenge over any other option available to her. Those choices have consequences. 7 men died because of those choices. The narrative of Aileen Wuornos as America's first female serial killer became sensationalized in media and film. The 2003 movie Monster portrayed her sympathetically, emphasizing her victimization and suggesting her crimes were inevitable products of her trauma. Some feminist writers adopted her as a symbol of women fighting back against male violence. But this romanticization ignores the reality. Aileen Wuornos was a serial killer who murdered 7 people for financial gain and personal gratification. Her gender doesn't change that. Her trauma doesn't excuse it. Her victims' imperfections don't justify their executions. What the case does expose is the dangerous intersection of poverty, mental illness, sexual violence, and criminal justice failure. Aileen Wuornos should have received help decades before she killed anyone. She should have been removed from her abusive home as a child. She should have received treatment for trauma and mental illness as a teenager. She should have had options beyond prostitution for survival as an adult. At dozens of points in her life, intervention could have changed her trajectory. But those interventions never came. She was arrested, briefly jailed, and released back into the same desperate circumstances repeatedly. The system criminalized her survival strategies, but offered no alternatives. By the time she killed Richard Mallory, Aileen Wuornos had been conditioned by decades of violence to believe that men were threats and that violence was the solution to every problem. The psychological damage was profound. But millions of people experience trauma without becoming killers. What distinguished Aileen was the specific combination of her trauma, her rage, her antisocial personality traits, and her access to a victim pool. Men who picked up hitchhikers, who were isolated with her on remote roads, who didn't expect violence from a woman. The fact that each man picked her up first became part of the narrative surrounding the case. It was used to suggest the men bore some responsibility for their deaths, that picking up a prostitute was risky behavior that invited consequences. But this logic is dangerous. Seeking out a prostitute, while potentially illegal and morally questionable, doesn't mean someone deserves to be murdered. The men who picked up Aileen Wuornos were exercising poor judgment, but they weren't consenting to be robbed and executed. Victim blaming serves only to minimize the killer's responsibility. The highway murders terrorized Florida for 13 months. Men stopped picking up hitchhikers. Prostitutes working the highways reported fewer clients and more suspicion. The case changed how law enforcement viewed female offenders. Suddenly, women could be serial killers, could be predators, could use their apparent vulnerability as a hunting strategy. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit studied Aileen Wuornos extensively, noting that her pattern differed from typical serial killers. Her motive was primarily financial. Her cooling-off periods were irregular. Her victim selection was opportunistic rather than ritualistic. What remained consistent was the violence. 7 men, each shot multiple times with a .22 pistol, each found in wooded areas off Florida highways, each robbed of money and possessions. The pattern was clear once investigators connected the cases. The unusual element was the killer's gender. Serial killing is overwhelmingly a male crime. When women kill multiple victims, they typically use poison, target people they know, and kill for insurance money or to escape relationships. Aileen Wuornos was an outlier, a woman who hunted strangers, used a gun, and killed for robbery and rage. The highways where she killed have been traveled by millions of people since. I-95, I-75, I-4, major arteries of Florida commerce and tourism. The dirt roads where she dumped bodies have been paved or grown over. The bars where she and Tyria drank have closed or changed names. The cheap motels where they stayed have been demolished or renovated. The physical locations of Aileen Wuornos's crimes have been absorbed back into Florida's landscape, unmarked and unmemorialized. But the 7 men she killed are gone forever. Richard Mallory, who stopped to pick up a hitchhiker. David Spears, heading home from a work site. Charles Carskadden, whose family identified his body through dental records. Troy Burris, found by hunters in the woods. Charles Humphreys, the retired police chief. Walter Antonio, the reserve officer. Peter Seams, whose abandoned car led to the crash that ultimately exposed the killers. 7 lives, 7 families shattered, 7 futures erased. Aileen Wuornos claimed she'd been fighting a war against men who victimized women like her. But these men weren't her abusers. They weren't her rapists. They weren't responsible for her childhood trauma or adult suffering. They were strangers who made the mistake of showing her a moment of accessibility, and she executed them for it. That's not justice. That's not self-defense. That's murder, repeated 7 times, each time becoming easier, each time revealing more clearly that Aileen Wuornos had crossed from victim to victimizer, from survivor to predator. The question that haunts the case is whether it could have been prevented. If the first killing was self-defense, If Richard Mallory did assault her, could the subsequent murders have been stopped if she'd reported it? Probably not. As a prostitute with a criminal record, Aileen wouldn't have been believed. The system that had failed her throughout her life wouldn't suddenly have protected her. She knew this. She'd reported rapes and assaults before and had been dismissed or blamed. So she didn't report the Mallory killing. She kept his money and car, and she discovered that killing was profitable. Each subsequent murder moved her further from any claim of self-defense. By the time she killed Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary who'd picked her up offering help, she was simply a serial killer, choosing targets of opportunity. The men who picked her up weren't predators in most cases. They were lonely, foolish, or just trying to be helpful. Some probably wanted sex. Others might have offered her a ride out of kindness. It didn't matter to Aileen. They were men. They were isolated with her. They were killable. That's the true horror of the Aileen Wuornos case. Not that she was a woman who killed, though that was unusual. Not that she was a victim who became a victimizer, though that was tragic. The horror is that she demonstrated how easily trauma can be weaponized, how readily victimhood can become excuse, how quickly the abused can become abusers when given opportunity and motivation. She had reasons for her rage. She had justifications in her mind. She had a lifetime of suffering to point to. But none of it made her victims less dead, their families less devastated, her actions less murderous. The Florida highways where Aileen Wuornos killed are still traveled by hitchhikers and drivers, by prostitutes and clients, by predators and prey. The dance of vulnerability and violence continues, usually without fatal consequences. But her case remains a warning about what happens when violence becomes normalized, when rage becomes operative principle, when survival strategies cross into predation. 7 men picked up a woman who appeared vulnerable. 7 men died because they made that choice. And 1 woman, shaped by decades of violence and neglect, chose to become the monster she'd been running from her entire life.